we did a quick snap poll. We called Mark Cuban, Dylan Ratigan, who was just on with you a moment ago, Scott Supak. Scott's a super trader by prediction market standards. He's a professional prediction market trader. He's been doing it for 10 years. His focus is politics and the climate markets. And Robert Cahaly, who was with us only a couple of weeks ago on the prediction trade. And we asked them for their best bets and actually kind of put a metaphorical gun to their head and said, you may not want to make a call in some of these races, but make them. So if you don't mind, I'd love to share the results with you.
All you timeless children with your predictions and flashbacks, trying to get ahead. What makes you think I can see you? What makes you think I believe you? Dreams inside my head. Have you heard this lately? We were stepping up waiting. Shot has come to pass. All the dreams were flying, all the thoughts were dying. Heard it's coming fast.
This is the Prediction Trade. I'm your host, Chris Vecchio, joined by my co-host, Jeff Joseph, as we take you through the latest contours in the betting markets. And what a day to have an episode, Mr. Joseph. We've seen some wild swings here as we approach November 5th.
Yeah, we're getting down to the wire, and we're not surprised. We've been talking about an inevitable regression back to the mean, to a closer race. I mean, there's been a disconnect in that the prediction market prices on both Cahaly and Poly market and Predicted have not been representative of the polling numbers we're seeing out of Nate Silver, 538, and RealClearPolitics. So when everyone's polling a 50-50 dead heat, essentially, with a 2 or 3% variance in either direction, you certainly couldn't justify the 65-35 or 60-40 spread we were seeing on Poly market and Cahaly. And I think those markets are starting to correct and come back to a more sensible representation of what the polling indicates.
Well, the polling has remained quite tight here in recent days. According to Nate Silver's latest betting model, when he pulls together all the odds, we're looking at a 48.5% polling average for Harris versus 47.4% for Trump. In previous episodes, we've discussed how any Democrat at the national level needs to effectively have a 2.5% favorability there in terms of that spread in order to be considered the favorite for the election. So while we're within that narrow margin right now, the market is judging that Trump may be the odds-on favorite. But that came crashing in today. We talk about the recursion trade, Jeff, and you and I have been long advocates of when either candidate gets to 60%, look to fade the move. Trump overshot that. He got up to 66, 67% on some platforms. And now we're seeing here today, it is a dramatic reversion to the mean. So let's just dig into that a little bit. Is this a function of how the betting market is structured? Is this just a dose of reality where people are looking at the polls in the final days and saying, you know what? This really isn't a race where he's a 2 and 3 favorite. It really is 50-50, and I should place my bets accordingly.
Well, you could probably look to sports wagering for some indication as to what that answer might be. And that is invariably, as much as the House tries to correct the imbalance and tries to get a equal offset so that the VIG is the only thing in question, it doesn't always happen that way. And sometimes the gambling house and sports wagering is at risk to a certain outcome. They try to mitigate that by shifting their lines and trying to get a 50-50 balance between the wagers, but it just doesn't always happen that way. And meanwhile, the players on the field aren't listening either. So I'm not the least bit surprised that we're seeing a disconnect between the betting markets and the polling markets. But again, we're also not surprised to see them come back and regress to where they should be. So I think, listen, it's well noted. It's a tight race right now. That's no surprise to anybody. And I think the more astute prediction market wagerer right now is looking for those distinct pockets of opportunity. And toward that, in today's issue of Luckbox, it comes out every Thursday. It's free. Subscribe at getluckbox.com. Today we shared some polling results, and you were unavailable, so I wasn't able to include you, but we did a quick snap poll. We called Mark Cuban, and Dylan Ratigan, who was just on with you a moment ago. Scott Supak. Scott's a super trader by prediction market standards. He's a professional prediction market trader. He's been doing it for 10 years. His focus is politics and the climate markets. And he works with a consortium. It's a group of 5 investors, one of them coming from a hedge fund, that pull their money together in the prediction markets. And so I talked to Scott, Mark Cuban, Dylan Ratigan, and Robert Cahaly, who was with us only a couple of weeks ago on the prediction trade. And we asked them for their best bets, and actually kind of put a metaphorical gun to their head and said, you may not want to make a call in some of these races, but make them. So if you don't mind, I'd love to share the results with you, because you weren't able to make it.
Well, you know what? This is actually, kids, learn to read, right? I see an email from Jeff yesterday morning when I get onto my computer for the first time, and it says, please send this in by noon tomorrow. But Jeff sent it the night before. So reading comprehension is very important. Jeff, why don't you read this? Because clearly I don't know how to.
Well, I'll be brief. But so the first question was, what swing states do you have a high degree of confidence? And we calibrated that at over 65% level of confidence. So what swing states do you have a high degree of confidence that Harris is likely to win? Cahaly, Republican pollster, Mark Cuban, Democratic surrogate, Jeff Joseph, and Scott Supak, this extraordinary trader, prediction market trader, all chose Wisconsin as a likely winning state for Harris. Cuban, Joseph, and Supak also chose Michigan, and Cuban and Supak chose Pennsylvania. So Mark Cuban, not so surprising, he is a surrogate, but he's also looking at internal polling that we're not saying. And Scott Supak all chose the blue wall going for Harris, which of course would probably result in a Harris victory. So that was worth noting. To finish that, Cuban actually only gave one state to Trump, and that was Georgia. And as far as Trump goes, Cahaly, Cuban, and myself chose Georgia. I have a wager. I am long GOP for Georgia. I am long Wisconsin for Harris, as well as Supak is. We disclosed where they actually had wagers. Cuban wasn't wagering or disclosing any wagers. And Michigan, I'm long Harris in Michigan, along with Scott Supak. So that was kind of the interesting takeaway. And since one of the things we talked about for this segment, being the second to last we have before Election Day, was that we would share some of our bets. So those are some markets I'm currently long. I'm long Harris in Michigan and Wisconsin. I'm long Trump in Georgia and Arizona are the 2 markets I'm long Trump in. Cahaly gave North Carolina to Trump. The next question was moving on to what party do you believe will win the House? Myself, Dylan Ratigan, and Scott Supak, who has a bet on this outcome, chose the Democrats to win the House. Cahaly chose the Republicans. Mark Cuban said he didn't have a strong feeling on that. Who do you believe will win the popular vote for president? Cuban, myself, Ratigan, and Supak all chose Harris. And Supak disclosed that he has a wager on Harris to win the popular vote. And Cahaly chose Trump. In the final polling question was, which candidate do you believe will win the Electoral College and consequently the presidency? Cuban, Ratigan, and Supak disclosed Harris as their choice. Ratigan and Supak disclosing that they have a wager to that effect. And myself and Cahaly chose Trump. And I disclosed that I do not have a wager on Trump to win the Electoral College. So that's the result of our polling. It's on the website at luckboxmagazine.com. It's not really a poll. Again, we were asking them to make forecasts here. So we thought we would share that with the readers today.
It's a great crowd of people to draw from. Obviously, different views on how the world works, different views on how politics work. So the fact that there are areas of agreement, I think, should be worth noting. And the way that these betting markets have shifted, Jeff, in the past 24 hours, you've caught quite the tailwind here for yourself in many of these places. Wisconsin, for example, polling at 60% for Trump yesterday. That's now down to 52%. That's a 16-point swing in less than 24 hours. We head over to Michigan as well, which as of this time, 2 days ago, Trump had a 7-point lead. And now we're looking at Harris up by about 8 points herself. So we can watch and see on how all these individual swing state levels, bettors are coming in and saying, you know what, there's some good value on the board here. This race is probably going to be closer than what maybe we've been led to believe because the polls have not broken. Jeff, you and I have discussed in recent weeks how when we look to political betting markets, they're a good way to check sentiment in real time. Are they better than polls? Are they not better than polls? That's a different story. That's a methodology question, right? It's a different view on how the situation is playing out. We look to betting markets sometimes as they go to anticipate the vibe shift, for lack of a better phrase. And so when the polls started to narrow at the end of September, beginning of October, the betting markets kind of took off. And I think they took off in the anticipation of the polls then validating that reality. But the reality of the situation is that has not happened. The polls have remained tight. And no matter where you look, basically everything's in the margin of error.
Well, that's pretty true. And when you look at this divergence that we noted earlier with Trump trading at a 65% probability when the polls suggested more of a 50-50 toss-up, the neophyte wagerer that applies maybe poker principles of money management and betting calibration to the prediction markets might say, here's an EV play. The polls are telling us it's a 50-50 race, and I can buy Harris for 35%. But there's a fallacy there. You know, I mean, in probability theory, the expected value is it's a random variable, right? It's weighted by the probability of certain outcomes. But what it requires is frequency. And if you don't have frequency to make up the difference, you have to throw out EV as a betting technique. So you can't say there's this big divergence. I can buy Harris for 35 cents, but she's really a 50% probability on the outcome, which means if I took this bet 100 times, I'm going to win it 50 times. So why wouldn't I buy it at 35? Well, you're not going to get this bet 100 times. You're going to get it once every 4 years. And quite frankly, you'll never get this wager again. So you have to throw expected value out the window. And I think that's something that a lot of wagers who take maybe poker principles or other gambling principles and bring it to elections might not be thinking about. It just doesn't apply. It doesn't work.
You and I have talked previously about how betting markets, even if they're not a de facto reflection of public sentiment, we clearly see myriad individuals point to them as a way to gauge how we're feeling in real time. There's been a number of people recently who have pointed out that it appears that there are a few whales that have been pushing around the betting markets that have perhaps exaggerated the odds in Trump's favor, which from then a betting perspective, it means that you're getting good value on the Harris side of the ticket. One such person, of course, is someone that you've interviewed here, a guy who goes by the name of Domer, a political betting professional who's been in the betting market since 2007. Jeff, he points out that in the market right now in Polymarket, where there are 38,038 unique traders, where 161,689,957 total shares have been traded, there is one wallet, which he's dubbed the Trump whale, which controls 29.1% of all the trades in this market right now.
Yeah, do you think 182 million shares assigned to those 5 accounts? That's right.
Which is incredible, right? Because the divergence here, just for a factor, just as a point of reference, the top 3 account holders on Polymarket for Trump, 29.1% of outstanding shares. The second, 8.2. The third, 7.6. On the Harris side of the table, the top 3 shareholders, one has 4.4%, another has 4.2, another has 3.8. So there is a certain concentration here on the Trump side of the trade that may or may not be pushing things around. What's your take on this situation? If there is a whale here that's, I don't want to say manipulating because that's not the right word, but when you have that much heft, you can push prices.
Sure.
So let's say, is there a whale here pushing prices around? Does that make this even more appealing, knowing that this really may not be a consensus view? It's really one person's view.
Manipulating isn't the word, as you and I have discussed, because it's distorting the price action, but he's not manipulating it, because he would be manipulating it in his favor because he's accumulating more shares at a higher price. So that's not in his best interest. It's pretty clear that there are some very large whales that are betting. Domo's quite a whale himself. He's a large wagerer, but not at that scale. All that means that's the other side of that expected value argument that I just laid forth, that you can't say, well, it's an EV play, because it isn't, but you can say that there's been a price distortion because of large outside bets, that you no longer have a Gaussian distribution in terms of what the mean is in terms of the wagering, and you have to buy expecting a regression back to the mean, and that's exactly, again, what we've seen. I think one of the things worth talking about, though, is where, what the super traders are doing. It's a community I know. We started the prediction trade 4 years ago, before the court ruling that allowed Cahaly to get in the game, when PredictIt was the only game in town for the most part. And I think I should mention this because a lot of people are flocking to prediction markets right now because it's fun. It's not the show. It's not like stepping up to the major leagues to trade options or trade in the market, but it's fun. It's recreational in the same way that sports wagering might be, and there are legitimate hedging purposes. But when we talk about these markets, of course, Polymarket's not accessible because it's offshore and it's crypto blockchain based. PredictIt is accessible, but now that Cahaly exists, it's worth noting for our listeners that it's just not a good market to trade in. First of all, it looks like they're on their way out. They probably won't have much legs ahead of them. They haven't added any markets in months, whereas the moment Cahaly won their appellate court ruling, within hours, they added dozens of markets. And there's also a huge fee differential. We traded on PredictIt because it was the only place we could trade, but there's an $850 cap on any one contract. And there's also a 5% withdrawal fee every time you take money out of PredictIt. Cahaly doesn't have those fees. There's no withdrawal fee other than a nominal charge. I think it's literally something like $2 when you withdraw money. But if you're withdrawing $10,000, paying a 5% fee is prohibitive for any type of trader. So Cahaly has certainly been the recipient of a wave of influx of capital, and for good reason. I wouldn't advocate PredictIt as a market for any of our listeners because the fees are just too oppressive.
Suppose that's a good time to mention that we'll be talking with both the CEOs of PredictIt and Cahaly on Tuesday night election night. Here on Tasty Live, we're going to be doing the Tasty Live election on special. Both John Phillips and Tariq Mansour will be joining us for conversation, so be sure to tune in. That's 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 Central Time, Tuesday, November 5th. On tastylive.com, of course, on the Tasty Live YouTube page as well. But let's redirect this conversation, Jeff, back into the final few days here. This is now no longer a market where you're treating it like a leap for those options traders out there. This is quickly becoming an option with a high degree of convexity. We are approaching expiration date, if you will. Now, many of these polls, many of these bets don't necessarily settle until there is a finalized set of numbers. For example, who wins the race, the condition may be until all three networks call the race in agreement, right? But for on these individual state levels, we're going to see the numbers come out over the course of the day. So first things first, Jeff, let's talk about this from the novice trader's perspective. Should novice betting market traders be paying any attention to any of the exit polls that they see, any of the information that comes out before any actual voting booth closes on Tuesday, November 5th?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. So there is a whole, as I said, there's an ecosystem of prediction market traders. And there's one of the things they do look at is exit polling. Exit polling is particularly valuable on election day because you have certain demographics that do early voting. And of course, as of right now, 59.8 million mail-in and early person votes have been cast nationally out of 62.9 million that were requested. So we're getting a a really strong early turnout. But the day exit polling on election day is always considered materially more valuable, and there'll be a lot of people watching. Steve Kornacki on the board making quick trading decisions. I'll be one of them on election night when I'm not watching the election special that you'll be on. And so those are some of the tools to keep in mind. I'll share something else with you, and I don't mind sharing that this is also coming from Scott Supak as well, who I mentioned is a super trader. One of the things that is very important is to catch a wave before it goes. The markets are liquid, and there's a lot of trading that goes on election night. And one of the best indicators are looking for bellwether counties, particularly in the central time zone, where there's early voting occurred. And Supak shared with me the counties that are on his short list, so I don't mind sharing them with readers. Now, this is getting in the weeds, but I'll just share it with you specifically. In Kentucky, he'll be looking at Boone, Kenton, Campbell, and Boyle counties. They are bellwether counties. If all of these shift to the left from 2020, it'll be very good for Harris. If they hold the same position, it leans towards Trump. And if they shift toward Trump, it really implies that these counties are going to indicate a Trump victory. So there are 4 counties in Kentucky that are going to be very closely watched. In Indiana, those 2 counties are Floyd and Clark County. They're in the southeast part of the state, around the Louisville metro area. So those 2 counties are going to be watched very closely by active prediction market traders. So that's something to keep in mind. Tools and resources, Decision Desk HQ is something that everybody will have open on their laptop, and everyone will be watching the needle move, the needle on the New York Times website, which is also very helpful as well. So those are some of the tools.
I'm on statins, Jeff.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
That's why my blood pressure is so high, because of that damn needle.
It's true. And another thing that's being watched too, and let's try to sort through some of the signal and noise. It's some of what we were doing in today's Luckbox letter that went out. The registration numbers, and you and I had an interesting offline conversation, and I have to agree with your conclusion that too much is being read into as favorable signals for the Trump campaign about the early voting data. And go ahead and say more about that, because I agreed with your premise on that.
Sure. So, I've seen a lot of people making hay of the fact that the Republican early voting numbers are up compared to Democrats, especially relative to 2020. And Elon Musk, of course, the owner of X, has been touting this a lot because he has a PAC that is supporting Trump. And it looks like that Elon Musk PAC is doing most of the get out of the vote work, which is another story for another time, probably not for a podcast of this ilk. But the point is that there's been a larger number of Republicans who are voting early. So turnout compared to 2020 for Republicans is much higher. I don't know if that's something that we really should be reading into, because 2020 was a really unique year. Democrats were all voting early. They were all voting absentee. They were voting early in person when it was available, because that's what the party was saying. Get it done, socially distance, avoid the long lines, avoid contact if possible. Whereas if people remember 2020, I do, Trump was telling people not to vote by mail, that it could be rife with fraud. Don't go vote early. Election day voting only. Go vote on election day. And you heard the whole ecosphere. How come every other country can just vote on a single day and we have to do it over the span of months? So now you have a situation where that's not the GOP platform position at all. They actually have been pushing people to vote early, to vote absentee, to do everything. You haven't heard Trump say anything to the degree that he was saying in 2020 about mail fraud. He's been actively encouraging it. But Democrats, on the other hand, not necessarily scared of getting COVID, not worried about social distancing. So I'm not looking at the comps compared to 2020. I'm looking at the comps compared to 2016. How is Republican turnout now in early voting compared to 2016? How is Democratic turnout now compared to 2016? And the answers are not really that different. Republicans are like 4 to 5% higher than they were in 2016. Democrats are about 3.5, 4. So the GOP does have an edge, but I don't think it's as large as it's been purported to be, which makes me think, again, the 65% chance of Trump winning is being overstated and being pumped up by, friendly actors, by surrogates.
Well, that's clearly the case. Let's call this a dead heat, because it is. It's going to come down to Pennsylvania, like we said quite some time ago. But on the early voting numbers, there is some good news for the Democrats. I've been sifting through those numbers carefully. And one of the things worth noting is something I noted today. Of those 59.8 million votes that have come in already nationally, 54% of them are from women, 44% from men. And considering the gender gap that's apparent in this election, I think that's really good news for the Democratic Party. That's good news for Harris. So I think that's worth noting. There's a 10-point differential between female and male votes coming in thus far. On the other side, if you look a little bit deeper, there's something that's been neglected and hasn't been spoken of too frequently. And that is that there has been a very material shift in voter registration between the two parties over the last 4 years. And I also pulled up some of those numbers. This is a result of several weeks of research that we've been working on. But in Pennsylvania, of course, the most important state as far as I'm concerned, the registration advantage for Democrats over Republicans has dropped from 7% to 4% over the last 4 years. That's a very big shift, considering that it's a state that was decided by 10,000 votes essentially last year, or last election. So that's, and then also just a moment ago, within the last couple hours, the American First Party Institute, which is a Republican get out the vote effort, put out a press release saying that over the last year, on an initiative that began over 1 year ago, they have contacted over 10 million voters in the state of Pennsylvania. And I think that's very good news for Trump. As to how effective they are is another question, but making contact, and they qualified contact specifically as either door-to-door canvassing or text interaction. 10 million voters over the last year. So that's the American First Party Institute. In the state of Nevada, the Democrats had a 22% registration advantage 4 years ago, but their numbers have dropped 4%, while the Republicans have gained 8%. So what you've seen in the last 4 years is more Republicans being registered, and the ratio of Democrats to Republicans shifting materially. In Arizona, the Democrats are down 2% from 4 years ago. And in North Carolina, they went from a plus 5% advantage to a mere plus 1% advantage over the last 4 years. So the shift in voter registration, not necessarily a foolproof indicator of vote outcome, is pretty material. It's definitely worth saying. And if we end up analyzing this, if this ends up being a key factor after the election, and we look back and say, sure, there were a lot more Republicans registered this time around, that blame is going to come back to Joe Biden for staying in the race too long. I talked to some people about this who said, well, if Biden would have jumped out earlier, we would have increased the enthusiasm, which is clearly evident on the Democratic side. Harris has really had a spike of enthusiasm for the Democrats since her candidacy was declared. Those numbers are noticeable, but had they have had 6 months to work with that, you probably would have seen increased Democratic voter registration as opposed to, the 6 weeks that they've had to work with. So I think that those are really important things to look at. The Republicans have had a favorable shift. For everything I can find on the Republican side, I can find something to offset it on the Democratic side that says this is a close election, and we need to be looking carefully in Buck and Erie County in Pennsylvania on election night to see how those key counties turn out.
Well, Jeff, I think Nate Silver said it best. Early data doesn't reliably predict results. 4 reasons why you're better off ignoring it. It's a part of the Silver Bulletin that he put up yesterday. I would recommend everyone go to check it out. Before we wrap up here, a quick bit of housekeeping. Tuesday's election day, November 5th. So we're going to be doing a special episode of the prediction trade Tuesday afternoon, same time as we usually do it on Thursday. So be sure to come back for that. We're going to do a little precap and then a little bit of recap. Tuesday pre-cap, Thursday recap here for the prediction trade, because this election may not be decided by Tuesday night. For Jeff Joseph, I've been Chris Vecchio. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of the prediction trade. And remember, always wager responsibly, believe in math, master your trade, and join us next week on the prediction trade.